August 19, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through the pine forests of Louisiana, carrying 28 German women toward an uncertain fate. Frieda Zimmerman pressed her face against the wooden slats, watching the unfamiliar landscape roll past. At 23 years old, she had served the Women's Auxiliary Corps as a radio operator in occupied France, believing she was defending her homeland. Now, she was a prisoner of war in a country she had been taught to despise. The truck slowed as it approached Camp Claiborne, a sprawling facility that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the punishing August sun. Frieda's throat was dry, her gray auxiliary uniform stiff with dried sweat and the dust of a 3-day journey. Beside her, 25-year-old Helga Richter from Cologne gripped the bench with white knuckles, her usual composure cracking under the weight of exhaustion and fear. They had been warned by male prisoners transferred earlier to expect harsh treatment. America would make them pay for every Allied soldier killed, every bomb dropped on London, every conquered territory. The women had prepared themselves for cruelty, for deprivation, for the kind of systematic humiliation they assumed all victors inflicted on the defeated. But as the truck doors opened and American soldiers gestured for them to disembark, Frieda noticed something that made no sense. The guards weren't sneering or hostile. They looked almost uncomfortable, uncertain how to handle female prisoners. A young private, barely old enough to shave, offered his hand to help Brigitte Meyer down from the truck bed. The 20-year-old from Nuremberg stared at the extended hand as if it might be a trap. The women were led into a processing building where they were assigned bunks, given fresh uniforms to replace their travel-stained clothes, and told that dinner would be served at 1800 hours. Frieda exchanged glances with Wilhelmina Kraus, a sharp-eyed 27-year-old from Leipzig who had served as an administrative officer. Neither woman spoke, but both were thinking the same thing. This wasn't what prisoners of war were supposed to experience. As the appointed hour approached, the women were escorted to a large mess hall. The moment Frieda stepped through the doors, she stopped so abruptly that Erna Vogel, 22 years old and from Essen, collided with her back. The smell hit them like a physical force. Rich, smoky, sweet, and somehow dark, all at once. It was completely unlike anything Frieda had encountered in years of rationed German meals or the thin soups served in military canteens. American soldiers sat at long tables, their plates piled high with food. Not the meager portions Frieda remembered from Germany, where every calorie was calculated and controlled, but generous servings that seemed almost obscene in their abundance. And there, at the serving line, she saw it. Great mounds of meat, dark and glistening, shredded into tender pieces that seemed to shimmer in their own juices. An American sergeant, a black man with kind eyes and weathered hands, smiled at the approaching German women. "Evening, ladies," he said in slow, careful English. "Hope you're hungry. Tonight we got pulled pork." Frieda stood frozen in the serving line, her metal tray trembling slightly in her hands. The sergeant waited patiently, his serving fork poised above the mountain of shredded meat. Behind her, she could hear the other German women whispering in confused German, their voices carrying the same disbelief she felt. In Frankfurt, before the war had consumed everything, Frieda had known plenty. Her father owned a printing business, and their family table had always held adequate food. But that was another lifetime. By 1943, bread had become dense and dark, stretched with sawdust and potato flour. Butter was a distant memory. Meat appeared perhaps once a week, and then only in portions so small they seemed like cruel jokes. The military rations had been worse. Thin cabbage soup with floating bits of gristle. Hard biscuits that required soaking before they could be chewed. Ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns that tasted like bitter earth. Frieda had learned to ignore her stomach's constant complaints, to treat hunger as simply another aspect of wartime service, like cold feet or interrupted sleep. But now, looking at the pulled pork, her body betrayed her. Her mouth watered uncontrollably, her stomach clenched with an almost painful anticipation. The smell alone seemed to contain more substance than a week's worth of German military rations. "Go on," the sergeant encouraged gently. "It won't bite you. That's my job." He smiled at his own joke, then added a generous portion to her tray. Beside the meat, he ladled a dark red sauce that caught the light like garnets. Then came cornbread, green beans cooked with bits of bacon, and creamy coleslaw. Frieda moved down the line in a daze. Helga received her portion next, her eyes wide with something that looked almost like panic. Brigitte whispered, "Das ist zu viel," under her breath. Too much. It was too much food for prisoners. Too much kindness from enemies. Too much contradiction to everything they had been taught. The German women clustered at a table separate from the American soldiers, their trays before them like altars to an unknown god. For a long moment, no one moved. They had been trained to maintain dignity, to show no weakness before their captors. But the smell rising from those plates was demolishing their resolve with every passing second. Mina Kraus broke first. She lifted her fork with hands that shook slightly, speared a small piece of the meat, and brought it to her lips. Her eyes closed. Her entire body seemed to soften. When she opened her eyes again, tears were streaming down her face. "Mein Gott," she whispered. "Mein Gott." That was all the permission the others needed. Frida took her first bite, and the world reorganized itself around that single moment. The meat dissolved on her tongue, smoky and sweet and tangy all at once. The texture was impossibly tender, nothing like the tough, gristly meat she remembered from Germany. The sauce added layers of flavor she couldn't begin to identify, tomatoes certainly, but also molasses, vinegar, spices she had no names for. She took another bite. And another. Around her, the other German women ate with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Sergeant William Tucker had been cooking for the army for 3 years, but he had never seen anyone eat quite like these German women. They weren't just hungry. They were consuming the food as if it held answers to questions they didn't know how to ask. He stood behind the serving line, watching them with a mixture of curiosity and something that felt uncomfortably like pity. Tucker had grown up in Mobile, Alabama, where his grandmother had taught him the sacred art of Southern barbecue. Low and slow, she always said. Good things can't be rushed. You got to give time for the smoke to work its way into the meat, for the fat to render down, for all those flavors to get acquainted with each other. He had enlisted in 1942, expecting to fight. Instead, the army had put him in a kitchen, deciding that a colored man's talents were better used feeding white soldiers than fighting beside them. The irony wasn't lost on Tucker. He couldn't eat at the same lunch counter as white folks back home, but here he was, cooking for them 3 meals a day. And now, cooking for the enemy too. The German women finished their first helpings in near silence, their forks scraping against metal trays with mechanical efficiency. Tucker watched as the young blonde one, she couldn't have been more than 20, stared at her empty plate with an expression of profound loss. Beside her, the older woman with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun was methodically licking sauce from her fingers, then catching herself and stopping abruptly, shame coloring her cheeks. Tucker made a decision. He stepped out from behind the serving line and approached their table. The women looked up at him with immediate wariness, their bodies tensing as if expecting punishment for enjoying their meal too much. "Y'all want seconds?" he asked in his slow Alabama drawl. "Plenty more where that came from." The women exchanged glances, confusion and desire warring visibly on their faces. The dark-haired one who had been licking her fingers spoke first, her English heavily accented but comprehensible. "This is permitted?" she asked carefully. "More food?" Tucker almost laughed, but caught himself. These women genuinely didn't understand that in America, even prisoners ate until they were full. "Ma'am," he said, addressing her with the same courtesy his grandmother had insisted he show all women, regardless of who they were, "in my kitchen, anybody who's still hungry gets fed. War or no war." He collected their trays and returned to the serving line, loading each one with another generous portion. When he brought them back, the dark-haired woman looked up at him with eyes that held 100 unspoken questions. "What is this meat?" she asked. "We have nothing like this in Germany." Tucker set down the trays and leaned against the table edge. "That's pulled pork, ma'am. Pork shoulder, smoked for about 12 hours over hickory wood. My grandmother's recipe, passed down through 4 generations of Tuckers." 12 hours? The woman's eyes widened. "For one meal?" "For one good meal," Tucker corrected gently. "See, good barbecue ain't about speed, it's about patience. About letting time and smoke do their work." 3 days after their arrival, Frida found herself standing outside the camp kitchen at dawn, waiting with Helga and Brigitte. The morning air still held a hint of coolness before the Louisiana heat would settle in like a suffocating blanket. Captain Morris, the camp administrator, had announced the previous evening that prisoners could volunteer for work assignments. Kitchen duty was available. Frida's hand had shot up before she could think better of it. She needed to understand. Needed to know how food that tasted like that could exist. How it could be made. How something so simple as a meal could challenge every assumption she had carried across the Atlantic. Sergeant Tucker arrived just as the sun began painting the eastern sky pink and gold. He looked surprised to see them waiting, but his expression quickly shifted to something that might have been approval. "Morning, ladies," he said, unlocking the kitchen door. "Hope y'all ready to work. We got 200 mouths to feed by 0700. The kitchen was enormous, filled with industrial stoves, massive pots, and refrigeration units that hummed with electric power. Frida had worked in military kitchens before, but never anything like this. The sheer scale of American abundance was overwhelming. Sacks of flour stacked higher than her head, crates of fresh vegetables, whole sides of beef hanging in the walk-in cooler. Tucker showed them how to prep vegetables, how to measure ingredients for the massive batches of cornbread, how to handle the industrial equipment safely. But it was clear from the beginning that he was observing them as much as instructing them. Testing them, perhaps, to see if enemy soldiers could be trusted with knives and access to food. Helga proved to be remarkably efficient, her precise movements revealing her background as an administrative officer accustomed to organization and systems. Brigitte was slower but meticulous, double-checking every measurement as if her life depended on accuracy. Frida found herself drawn to the rhythms of kitchen work, the way preparation flowed into cooking, cooking into serving, a cycle as reliable as breathing. By the third day in the kitchen, something had shifted. Tucker began talking to them not as prisoners but as kitchen staff. He explained the differences between cuts of pork, demonstrated how to tell when oil was hot enough for frying, shared tricks for keeping cornbread moist. The women asked questions, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. It was Mina who finally asked the question they had all been wondering. She had joined them on the second day, her curiosity about American cooking overcoming her natural caution. "Sergeant Tucker," she said carefully, her English improving daily from constant practice, "why do you give prisoners such good food? We are your enemies." Tucker paused in his work, setting down the knife he had been using to trim fat from a pork shoulder. He looked at the 4 German women surrounding him, their faces open and genuinely confused. "My grandmother used to say something," he began slowly. "She'd say, 'Baby, you can tell everything about a person's heart by watching how they treat folks who can't do nothing for them. Y'all are prisoners. You can't hurt us, can't help us. So how we treat you? That says who we are, not who you are.'" 2 months into their captivity, Frida sat in the camp library with a piece of paper before her and a pen that felt impossibly heavy in her hand. The International Red Cross had established mail service for prisoners of war, and she had finally received confirmation that her parents in Frankfurt were alive. Now she had to write back, had to somehow explain her existence in this strange Louisiana prison camp. "Dear Mutti and Vati," she began, then stopped. How could she describe any of this? How could she tell them about the pulled pork, about Sergeant Tucker's kindness, about the way her understanding of America had been turned completely inside out? She started again. "I am well, and being treated fairly, according to Geneva Convention standards. The weather here is very hot and humid, nothing like home. We are given work assignments to pass the time." The words felt hollow, stripped of any real truth. Across the table, Helga was similarly struggling with her own letter. Brigitte had already given up, her crumpled attempts scattered around her like fallen leaves. "How do we tell them?" Brigitte whispered in German. "How do we explain that we eat better here than they do at home?" It was true, and they all knew it. Letters from Germany painted increasingly desperate pictures. Rations had been cut again. The black market demanded prices no ordinary family could afford. Children were going to bed hungry. Cities were being bombed into rubble. And here they sat, prisoners of war, eating pulled pork and cornbread, gaining weight, while their families starved. Frida forced herself to continue writing. She described the camp, the other women, the work in the kitchen. She kept her tone neutral, factual, revealing nothing of the emotional earthquake happening inside her. She certainly didn't mention that yesterday, Sergeant Tucker had taught her how to make coleslaw, or that the simple act of Shredding cabbage alongside an American soldier had felt more real than anything she had experienced in her 2 years of military service. Then, the news arrived that changed everything. Captain Morris called an assembly on a cold November afternoon. His face was grave as he stood before the gathered prisoners. He held newspapers, photographs, documents that he spread across a table with hands that trembled slightly. "Ladies," he said quietly, "I need to show you something. Information is coming back from Europe, from Germany, about places called Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen." Frida didn't understand at first. These were just names, unfamiliar German words that meant nothing to her. But then Morris began showing the photographs, images so horrific that several women gasped and turned away. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms, mass graves, furnaces, evidence of systematic murder on a scale that seemed impossible to comprehend. "These are concentration camps," Morris continued, his voice heavy. "We're discovering them as Allied forces advance. Your government built them, operated them, used them to exterminate millions of people. Jews, political prisoners, anyone they deemed undesirable." Frida felt her vision narrow, the edges of the room going dark. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be her Germany, her country, the nation she had proudly served. But the photographs didn't lie. The testimony of liberating soldiers didn't lie. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, monstrous. That evening, she tried to return to her letter. The paper sat before her, mocking her with its incomplete sentences about weather and work assignments. The kitchen became Frida's refuge in the weeks following the revelations about the concentration camps. While other prisoners sat in stunned silence or gathered in tearful groups, trying to make sense of the impossible horror their country had committed, Frida threw herself into the physical work of cooking. Her hands needed tasks. Her mind needed the distraction of measurements and temperatures and timing. Sergeant Tucker seemed to understand without her having to explain. He gave her more responsibilities, taught her more techniques, treated her like an apprentice rather than a prisoner. On a Wednesday morning in early December, he arrived at the kitchen carrying a pork shoulder that must have weighed 20 pounds. "Today," he announced, "I'm going to teach you ladies the real secret of pulled pork, from start to finish." Helga looked up from the potatoes she was peeling. "You would share this? Your grandmother's recipe?" Tucker set the meat down on the steel preparation table with a heavy thud. "My grandmother also taught me that recipes aren't meant to be hoarded. They're meant to be passed on to people who'll respect them, who'll care about doing them right." He began by showing them how to prepare the rub, a mixture of brown sugar, paprika, black pepper, salt, garlic powder, and a dozen other spices he kept, in unmarked jars. His hands moved with practiced precision, measuring by instinct rather than measurement. "Now, most folks think barbecue is about the sauce," he explained as Frida carefully mixed the spices under his watchful eye. "But real barbecue is about 3 things: time, smoke, and patience. The sauce is just the ribbon on the gift." They worked together to coat the massive shoulder with the spice rub, Tucker guiding their hands to ensure even coverage. Then came the smoking process. He led them outside to the custom smoker he had convinced the army to let him build. A large metal drum modified with careful precision. "Hickory wood," he said, showing them the chunks he had been soaking in water overnight. "You want the smoke to be thin and blue, not thick and white. Thick smoke makes the meat bitter. Patient smoke makes it perfect." The process took hours. Tucker taught them how to maintain consistent temperature, how to recognize when the meat needed more smoke, how to judge doneness not by time but by feel and appearance. Every 2 hours, they checked the shoulder, adding wood, adjusting vents, learning to read the subtle signs that distinguished good barbecue from great barbecue. Mina arrived mid-morning and watched with fascination as Tucker demonstrated the technique of spritzing the meat with apple cider vinegar to keep the exterior moist. "This is like chemistry," she observed in her careful English, "but also, like art." "That's exactly right," Tucker agreed. "You got to understand the science, but you also got to feel it. Got to listen to what the meat is telling you." As the hours passed and the smell of smoking pork filled the air around the kitchen, Frida found herself thinking about time and transformation. About how something tough and difficult could become tender and good when treated with patience and care. May 8, 1945. The announcement crackled through the camp's loudspeakers at 1100 hours. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Victory in Europe Day had arrived. In the American barracks, soldiers erupted in celebration. Cheers echoed across the compound. Men embraced, wept, shouted with relief that they wouldn't be shipping out to finish the fighting. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years was finally ending. In the women's prisoner barracks, there was only silence. Frida sat on her bunk, hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. Around her, the other German women maintained the same frozen stillness. This should have been good news. The war was over. The killing would stop. Eventually, they would go home. But home to what? Helga broke the silence first, her voice hollow. My brother was in Berlin. I haven't heard from him in 8 months. My sister lived in Dresden, Brigitte whispered, before the bombing. One by one, the women began cataloging their losses, their fears, their uncertainty. Germany was defeated, occupied, divided among the victors. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead or displaced. The country they had served no longer existed in any form they would recognize. That evening, the mess hall felt surreal. American soldiers celebrated with extra desserts and coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of the usual bitter substitute. The German women filed through the serving line as always, but everything felt different now. They were no longer prisoners of an enemy nation at war. They were simply defeated, their status uncertain, their futures blank. Sergeant Tucker served the pulled pork as he had every Wednesday for months. But when Frida reached the front of the line, he paused before filling her plate. I know this is a hard day for y'all, he said quietly, but you're still welcome at my table. Frida accepted her plate with hands that trembled slightly. The food looked the same, smelled the same, but when she sat down and took her first bite, it tasted different. Every flavor seemed to carry a question she couldn't answer. The other women ate mechanically, without the enthusiasm that had characterized their first months in the camp. The pulled pork that had once seemed like a miracle now felt like evidence of their betrayal. How could they have grown comfortable here? How could they have learned to love American food, American kindness, American abundance, while their country burned? Mina pushed her half-eaten plate away. What happens to us now? No one had an answer. They sat in the mess hall, surrounded by celebrating soldiers, eating food prepared by hands that had shown them more kindness than they deserved, and contemplated a future that felt more terrifying than any battle. Victory had arrived, but it tasted like ash in their mouths. The war was over, but their personal reckoning had only just begun. In a few weeks, repatriation orders would come. They would be sent back to Germany, back to whatever remained. The repatriation orders arrived on June 3, 1945. Captain Morris gathered the German women in the assembly hall and read from official documents stamped with War Department seals. Transportation would be arranged within 3 weeks. They would be processed through camps in France, then released to return to whatever homes they could find in occupied Germany. The women listened in silence. This was what they had been waiting for since their capture: freedom, return, the end of their imprisonment. Yet as Morris outlined the procedures, Frida felt a growing sense of dread that had nothing to do with the Atlantic crossing or the uncertainty of what awaited them in Germany. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk listening to the sounds of the barracks, the breathing of 27 other women, each wrestling with their own fears. Finally, she rose and walked to the kitchen. It was after midnight, but she knew Tucker sometimes came early to prepare for the next day's breakfast. She found him sitting on the back steps, smoking a cigarette and looking up at the stars. He glanced over as she approached, but didn't seem surprised to see her. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. Frida sat down beside him, maintaining a respectful distance. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the words came tumbling out in a mixture of English and German, her careful grammar dissolving under the weight of emotions she could no longer contain. "Sergeant Tucker, I don't know how to go back. I don't know how to return to a place where children are starving while I've been eating pulled pork and cornbread. How do I explain to my family that I learned to cook American barbecue while they learned to survive on potato peels and hope?" Tucker took a long drag on his cigarette, exhaling slowly. "You think staying here would be easier?" "I think." Frida paused, searching for words in English adequate to express what she felt. "I think I have learned something here. About what it means to treat people with dignity. About what a country can be when it chooses kindness over cruelty, In Germany, I will be a failure. A soldier who was captured. A woman who should be ashamed. Here, I have been given the chance to become someone different. You know, staying ain't really an option, right? Tucker said gently. You're prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention says. His tone wasn't mocking, but genuinely curious. Frida looked at the pulled pork on her plate, then at Sergeant Tucker, who watched with an expression she couldn't quite read. Yes, she said simply, it is about the food, but not in the way you think. A country that treats even its enemies with this much dignity, that feeds prisoners as if they were guests, that teaches them skills instead of punishing them, that is a country worth belonging to. We have learned what real freedom tastes like. We cannot unlearn it now. 1960. 15 years had passed since that unprecedented day when 12 German women stood before Captain Morris and asked to stay in the country that had captured them. The request had triggered months of bureaucratic deliberation, legal consultations, and congressional debate. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The women would be reclassified as displaced persons, eligible for immigration if they could secure American sponsors. The Henderson family from Baton Rouge had sponsored Frida. Sergeant William Tucker had vouched for her character, writing a letter to immigration officials that described her dedication, her skills, and her genuine transformation. By December 1945, Frida Zimmerman had become a legal resident of the United States. Now she stood in her own restaurant, a small establishment on a quiet street corner in Baton Rouge called Tucker's Legacy. The name honored the man who had taught her that food could be a bridge between enemies, that patience and smoke could transform something tough into something tender. The menu reflected her journey. Authentic Southern pulled pork prepared according to the recipe Tucker had entrusted to her, sat alongside German potato salad and apple strudel. Cornbread shared space with sauerkraut. The restaurant had become a symbol of reconciliation, a place where two cultures met not in conflict, but in shared appreciation of good food made with care. Frida no longer went by Zimmerman alone. 3 years after arriving in Baton Rouge, she had married Sergeant William Tucker in a quiet ceremony that made headlines in the local papers. Former German prisoner weds the American soldier who fed her. The story had captured something essential about America's capacity for transformation and second chances. Tucker worked beside her in the kitchen, still teaching, still patient, still believing that you could tell everything about a person's heart by how they treated those who could do nothing for them. Their restaurant had become a gathering place for veterans, former prisoners, German immigrants, and anyone who believed that old hatreds didn't have to define new futures. On this particular evening, Frida was preparing for a special dinner. Helga was visiting from New York, where she worked as a translator for the United Nations. Mina had driven down from You got to be repatriated. What if we asked? Frida's voice was barely a whisper. What if we asked to stay? Tucker turned to look at her directly, his expression unreadable in the darkness. You serious about this? I don't know yet, Frida admitted, but I think I need to find out if I'm the only one thinking it. She wasn't. Over the next week, Frida spoke quietly with the other women. Helga, Brigitte, Mina, Erna, and 7 others. Conversations held in whispers, weighing impossible choices between 2 different kinds of hunger. June 15, 1945. Sergeant Tucker had organized a farewell barbecue for the departing German prisoners. He spent 2 days preparing, smoking 3 massive pork shoulders over hickory wood, making enough coleslaw and cornbread to feed the entire camp twice over. It was meant to be a gesture of closure, a final act of kindness before the women returned to their uncertain futures. But Frida had other plans. She had spent the previous week in careful conversation with 11 other women, Helga, Brigitte, Mina, Erna, and 7 others whose families were confirmed dead or whose hometowns no longer existed. Women who had discovered something in this Louisiana prison camp that felt more like home than the rubble waiting for them across the Atlantic. The barbecue was held outside in the warm evening air. Long tables had been set up, and for once, American soldiers and German prisoners sat together without the careful separation that had marked earlier months. The pulled pork was Tucker's finest work, tender and flavorful, the meat falling apart at the gentlest touch. Captain Morris stood to make a brief speech about reconciliation and new beginnings. He wished the women well, expressed hope that they would find their families and help rebuild their country. It was a kind speech, carefully constructed to acknowledge the complexity of the situation. When he finished, Frida stood. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice remained steady. "Captain Morris, may I speak?" Morris looked surprised but nodded. "Of course." Frida glanced at the 11 women who had agreed to stand with her. One by one, they rose from their seats. The gesture sent a ripple of confusion through the assembled crowd. "Captain Morris, we have a request." Frida began in careful English. 12 of us wish to formally petition not to be repatriated. We wish to remain in the United States." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the cicadas seemed to pause their evening song. Morris recovered first. "Miss Zimmerman, I'm not sure you understand. You're prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention requires your repatriation." "We understand, sir," Helga added, her voice firm. "But we are asking if there is any legal provision for prisoners who have no homes to return to, whose families are gone, who wish to become displaced persons rather than repatriated nationals." "This is about the food, isn't it?" asked Lieutenant Peterson, one of the younger American officers. Chicago with her American husband and 3 children. Erna was flying in from California. Even Brigitte, who had eventually returned to Germany in 1952 to help with reconstruction, was making the journey. As smoke rose from the barbecue pit behind the restaurant, Frida thought about that first meal in Camp Claiborne. How the smell of pulled pork had challenged everything she believed about her enemies. How Sergeant Tucker's patience had taught her that transformation took time, that good things couldn't be rushed. She had learned that home wasn't about where you were born, but about where you chose to build a life that honored the best possibilities of human nature. That forgiveness was earned through action, not given through words. And that sometimes, the most profound revolutions began not with grand gestures, but with something as simple as a shared meal. The smoke continued to rise, carrying with it the promise that hatred could be transformed into belonging.